In the Orthodox tradition, the week of Palm Sunday actually starts a little bit before the actual day. That's why in the Ethiopian tradition, starting from the midpoint of the week of Nicodemus, which is Wednesday, the liturgy of St. Gregory of Nyssa, Qaddasie Gorgorios, which is the Palm Sunday liturgy, the liturgy of Hosanna, begins to be celebrated. And in the wider Orthodox tradition, going outside of our local rite, the eve of Palm Sunday is known by many Orthodox Christians as Lazarus Saturday, Lazarus Saturday. And both traditions, both our local tradition and the wider tradition of other Orthodox Christians from other rites, is pointing to the fact that Christ's procession, Christ's entry into Jerusalem, really is the climax of what was stirring among the Israelites. And in order for us to understand the climactic sense of Christ's procession, we have to understand the resurrection of Lazarus. Why is the resurrection of Lazarus important? Well, it's important because it's a foreshadowing of the salvific events that are going to take place. It's a foreshadowing of the events that are going to take place within the next eventful days. And that's why St. John in the Gospel places the miracle of Lazarus' resurrection as the seventh and final miracle of the Gospel. So let's understand a little bit more about what we're talking about. We learned that Lazarus was a beloved of the Lord. He was the brother of Martha and Mary of Bethany. And when Christ arrived at Bethany, Lazarus had died. Not only had he died, but he'd been dead for 4 days. And this death of 4 days is important. In fact, in some Orthodox traditions, Lazarus is actually known as Saint Lazarus of 4 days dead. That's like one of the ways we recognize and understand him. And the reason why we do this is because the 4 days in the Jewish tradition was a signifier of the permanence of death. In the Jewish tradition, the soul descended into Hades permanently after 3 days. So resurrection was possible, maybe not probable, but possible during the 3-day period. And we've seen instances of people raised from the dead in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. But it was always within this 3-day period. And that's why the burial rite of the body was a 3-day process. And furthermore, in the Mediterranean heat, a body that's 4 days old, 3 days, 3 nights, would have an odor. And we actually read in the gospel that Martha is reluctant to open the tomb of Lazarus for Jesus because of the stench, because of the odor. So 4 days is important because 4 days means death has become permanent, 1, and 2, the body is beginning to exude the stench of death. The smell of death begins to permeate the body at the 4-day mark. And the reason why Christ does not raise Lazarus before the 4 days is to show his authority. To show his authority. Christ was not like the former prophets who, as vessels of divine power, had raised people from the dead, but rather Christ holds in his hands authority over death. And he is, as he explained to Martha, the resurrection and the life himself. Christ is not just the resurrector, but he is the resurrection himself. So that's why he waits for 4 days. This miracle, the raising of Lazarus, is the last messianic miracle of Christ. It's the last messianic miracle of Christ, and that's why St. John, who, as we know, everything in the Gospel of John has a mystery, that's why he makes this miracle the last miracle, period. And the reason why I say it's the last messianic miracle is because it's the last miracle in which Christ shows his position as the Savior, as the Theanthropos, as the God-man. When Christ arrives at the tomb of Lazarus, the Gospel tells us that Jesus wept. That's actually the shortest sentence in the Bible. Jesus wept. And it tells us twice in this passage that Jesus was moved in the spirit and troubled. And here we can see the humanity and the emotion of Christ. He sheds tears. He is sorrowful. And this is a foreshadowing of the sorrow and of the tears of the world which he would take upon himself in his own suffering. But at the same time, we also see Christ in a loud voice order, command, for Lazarus to arise and come out. And we see Lazarus raised to life in obedience to this divine command of authority, which shows in turn the divinity of Christ. It's a foreshadowing of the resurrection of Christ, which he worked in his divinity. So here we see a symbol, a sign, an icon, so to speak, of the messianic position of Christ as the Redeemer, as the God-man. And it's this miracle that leads to Palm Sunday, that triggers Hosanna. And it leads, in actuality, it actually leads to the entirety of Holy Week. And we say this for two reasons. First, the people gather at the gate of Jerusalem because they've heard of the resurrection of Lazarus. They heard that Christ had raised a man 4 days dead to life. And so they've heard about this miracle. They're eager to see this person who has authority over death. And it also sets off the events of Holy Week because the deliberation over whether Christ should be killed by the Sanhedrin, by the Jewish authorities, begins once they hear about this miracle. That was the last straw for them. They were indignant. So this is a triggering event.